So, but then the Gemara says, well, hold on a second, we're not really following this rule so consistently. Because Ihachi Seifa. So what about, if that's true, so what about the Seifa? Seifa normally means the last part of the Mishnah. In this case, we have to assume a combined Mishnah to say that, because it's really a reference to a Mishnah that's printed in our Gemaras later on, in Daf Yud Aleph. So it calls it the Seifa. In our Masechtas, it's a separate Mishnah. So what about the end of the discussion? Diksani later on, that when the Mishnah talks about the brachos that are recited in the context of Kriya Shema, so it says, B'shachar mevarach shtayim lefanea v'achas lachareh. So in the morning we recite 2 brachos before and 1 bracha after. U'be'erev mevarach shtayim lefanea v'shtayim lachareh. We do 2 before and 2 after. So there again, shouldn't we say, listening to our inspiration, why don't we start with Myra first? And we should follow the same pattern. So then the Gemara gives an answer which a little bit less satisfying. That, well, the way it worked was a little bit sort of stream of consciousness. Tana Pasach Ba'arvis. The Mishnah starts off talking about Ma'ariv. V'hadar Tani B'shachris. And then it gets up to Shachris. So Ad Dekai B'shachris, Parish Milu de Shachris. So once we're talking about Shachris, let's talk about everything involving Shachris. V'hadar Parish Milu de Arvis. And it comes back to the subject of Ma'ariv. So essentially we have a chiastic structure where it essentially goes Ma'ariv Shachris, Shachris Ma'ariv, and we'll be okay with that. I think we mentioned that there was a diuk that the Vilna Gaon made on this contrast. We'll mention it again because here the Gemara is bringing the 2 Mishnayos in contrast to each other. That he noted the plural language in this Mishnah, that Memasai Korin, and that the Mishnah talks about Brochos. Brochos Kriya Shema says Mevarach is a singular language. And the Vilna Gaon said that was significant. That when it comes to a bracha, you can have one person recite a bracha on behalf of others. That's the principle of Shomea Ka'ona. When it comes to Kriya Shema, he maintained you can't have Shomea Ka'ona. Everyone has to recite their own Kriya Shema. So I think we talked about this a little bit. We talked about why that might be, and the fact that not everyone agreed with that. That it's not clear that that's true lahalacha. The Shagis Aryeh, for example, has a discussion where he doesn't assume that way. But this was Vilna Gaon's comment, which he has a commentary to Mishnayos called the Shnos Elio. So he makes that observation. As a Ritva, the Ritva has a comment along similar lines. He's not necessarily reflecting on Kriya Shema, but when he talks about first Mishnah in Megillah, so the Mishnah there says Megillah Nikreis, so the Ritva there says also that there is a singular language because Megillah, as we know, usually is done with Shomea Ka'ona. You have one person reading the Megillah on behalf of the congregation. So the Ritva along the lines of this Vilna Gaon is similar in that he notes the singular versus plural language as reflecting a Shomea Ka'ona issue, and here the Vilna Gaon has his idea that it doesn't apply to Kriya Shema, and that's why we have the plural language. He's contrasting it with this Mishnah that the Gemara quotes. Okay, fine. So now the Gemara gets into a couple of complicated discussions about this whole time about, first of all, the mentioning of the Kohanim, using that as the indicator of when exactly Kriya Shema starts. So it's an unusual way of phrasing things. So to do that point first, so the Gemara asked a question that was probably in our minds when we read the Mishnah. Does Amar Mar, Misha Shakohanim Nichnasim Le'achal B'Trumasa. Okay, says the Mishnah, from the time that the Kohanim go in to eat their Truma, that's when we start Kriya Shema. So here's the question that probably occurred to us. So Michte Kohanim, Emas Kachli Truma. Since the Kohanim, when do they eat the Truma? Mishas Seisa Kochavim, from the time when the stars come out. So listing Mishas Seisa Kochavim, why the Mishnah just say Seisa Kochavim? That would be a little more straightforward. That would be a more direct way of telling us what time it is. So says the Gemara, Milsa Agavarche Kamash Malan. So this is coming to teach us a lesson. This is itself a lesson that we try to get as much Torah in as possible. So the Mishnah already, the first lines in the Talmud, the Mishnah is already trying to stick another Mishnah, another message in. Not satisfied with minimal teaching, but it's trying to add some other ideas. So Milsa Agavarche Kamash Malan, you could learn at the same time that Kohanim Emas Kachli B'Truma Mishas Seisa Kochavim. So it's teaching us that is when the Kohanim eat Truma. V'hakamashmon, this also tells us the kapara lo ma'akva. Kapara being a reference to the korban the next day. That here you have the Kohanim who have to be tar in order to eat the Truma, so they have to finish their purification process. So at the end of the 7th day, they wait 7 days, and then at the end of the 7th day, so when the sun comes down, apparently So far it's going to be a discussion, but apparently then they become tar. So when the stars come out, and it's Tzeis HaKochavim, that's the time when apparently they become purified, and then they can go in and eat their truma. So there's an additional lesson here also that you might have thought they have to wait till the next morning when they bring a korban, the korban which is called a kapara. So apparently that's not the case. Apparently no, they don't have to wait for the korban, that as soon as the stars come out of the end of the 7th day, beginning of the 8th day, so then they can already go in and eat truma. So we have a whole bunch of messages packed into that one line of the Mishnah. And how do we know that? Kedetanya, as the pasuk says in Vayikra, Uva Hashemesh v'taher. So the sun comes, and we try to translate this loosely because we see it's a whole discussion. The sun comes and there is purification. So bias shamsho makvaso mileachel b'truma, v'ein kaparaso makvaso mileachel b'truma. So waiting for the sun to leave, even though we use the word to come, which is itself going to be a discussion, but waiting for the sun to go down, that's what he has to do in order to be able to eat truma. But not kaparaso, but waiting for the korban the next day, that's not necessary in order for him to eat truma. So then asks the Gemara, Umimai dahayu vo hashemesh bias hashemesh. Well, how do we know that we're reading that pasuk correctly? How do we know that vo hashemesh means that the sun goes down? V'hai v'tar tar yoma. And the purification that we're talking about is the day essentially ending, is the day, a new day starting, a purification of the day. Start at the top of the next page. Dilma bios arohu. Maybe we're referring to the light coming up the next morning. And we got some of the new Amud that definitely accelerates it towards finishing shots. Umay v'tar tar gavra. And what is the tar referring to? It's referring to a personal purification of the individual when he brings his korban. So maybe this uba v'tar, it comes and there is a purification. Maybe it doesn't refer to the sun setting and the day changing status. Maybe it refers to the sun coming up in the morning and then the individual purifying himself. So that's the way Rashi understands what's going on. You should take note of the fact that Tosfos understands it differently. Rashi understands that the issue here is between whether we're talking about nighttime or the next morning. Tosfos assumes that it's a different cheshbon here, that the question is between two of the markers of night. That why are we assuming we're talking about Tzeis HaKochavim? Maybe we could be talking about Shkias HaChama. And that's a whole discussion that I want to get to in connection with this Amud. We will get to the end of the Amud first, where some other themes come up. So we'll read to the bottom first before talking about it, and we'll see how much we get to say about it tonight, or we'll carry it to the next time. But essentially, very, very loosely, so there are at least two markers of night. There's the beginning of the process, which is Shkias HaChama, when the sun starts to go down. And then when the end of the process is marked by Tzeis HaKochavim, by the stars coming out. So Tosfos raises the question that he thinks those are really the two possibilities the Gemara is talking about. That our Mishnah is assuming we're talking about Tzeis HaKochavim. Maybe it's not Tzeis HaKochavim, maybe it's Shkias HaChama. And that's the whole question. So that's just the tip of the iceberg of that whole discussion, of the whole Shkia Tzeis issue. And Rabbi Tam has a big story to play in this, which Tosfos invokes. So before going any further, we'll come back to that when we get to the end of the Yom. So, but in any event, Machlokas Rashi and Tosfos how to understand this question. But in any event, the Gemara gives the answer. It says, Amar Barav Sheila Im Kelim Makra V'yi Toher. My V'taher Tar Yoma. That the phrase V'taher is apparently a reference to the day, and it's consistent with the expression that we all know, Kedam Yinshi, as everyone says. I always hear people saying this, Erev Shimsha V'ki Yoma, that the sun goes away and the day ends. So that's apparently what's referred to here, and that makes it all incredibly clear. So Bamarava, so in the west, in Eretz Yisrael, so Hadar Abba Barav Sheila Lo Shmiel, we didn't hear that word. So they asked the question on their own, Abai Lemi Bai, How Yuvo Hashemesh Bias Shamshahu, or My V'tar Tar Yoma, or Dilma Bias Arahu, My V'tar Tar Gavra. So which one is it? How do we know how to understand what the pasuk means? V'hadar Pashtu Lemi Braisa, and they answered it from looking to a Braisa. Midiksani B'Braisa, because they learned in a Braisa, Simin L'davar Tzeis HaKochavim. The sign for this whole story is Tzeis HaKochavim. So there, that teaches us what the pasuk means. Shema mina bias sham shohu. That it means when the sun is gone. U'ma'vatar tar yoma, and it's when the day takes on this status of purification. Okay, so now the Gemara gets into a very complicated back and forth, which we'll try to read together, where it tries to figure out what exactly this idea of the Kohanim comes to represent, and the fact that there are other opinions as to what the marker is. And then there's a very complicated back and forth about how do we keep all these markers straight. How do we understand how they chronologically rack up with each other. And these ideas, we're not going to know exactly what time they reflect on the clock, but just to recall that this was the Re's answer when we saw the Tosfos about how is it that we are able to say Kriya Shema Shul earlier. So Tosfos' view was that we are Yotzei Kriya Shema at that time, even though it's a problem with the Mishnah. So the Re's answer was that we follow these other opinions, that we're going to see a whole slew of other opinions that pegs things a little bit earlier, and that's also a possibility, and therefore Kriya Shema could be earlier. Before we go further in this daf, I just want to mention one point from the previous daf, that when we mentioned the reference to the Mishnah about counting the brachos of Kriya Shema, so if you look back for a second and post in the Brochos 2.1, so there that comes to a total of 7 brachos. So 4 at night, 2 before, 2 after, and 3 in the morning, so that's a total of 7. So Tosfos says there's a significance to that. The Sheva brachos heavy keneged Sheva b'yom ha'olticha. It's a reference to a pasuk in Tehillim which says, "I will praise you 7 times in the day." So Tosfos says, what about Yiru Einenu? Right, so that there's different practices nowadays as to whether or not to say this. So in the Sidurim, so you have when you daven Ma'ariv, so after La'ad, so then there is Baruch Hashem La'olam and Yiru Einenu. So many congregations don't recite this psukim and don't recite this section, and some do. So should this be counted in terms of the brachos? So Tosfos says no. That was really just there as a stalling tactic. We're afraid that people would be behind, so we added some extra words there so that people shouldn't have to walk home alone. They should have an opportunity to catch up and have people to walk home with you. And here, this is the next line is a little difficult. So the Dav Gebeis HaKnesses Shalahem. So this is only true in the old time shuls. Shahayu Omdim Besada, they were in the middle of the field, middle of nowhere. Vahayu Musikanim and Mazikin, and there was a danger from all kinds of damaging forces that could be out there. Avalbati Knessia Shalanu, no problem. Marshals are all in safe, happy places. So therefore, we don't have such a need to stall. Ella Balayla, except at night. So you'll say, well, wait a minute, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Ma'ariv. So then what does it mean we only have to do this at night? So it seems to be, I assume, it's a reference to the fact that we said before that often they would be davening Ma'ariv early. So even though it's Ma'ariv, it doesn't necessarily mean it's dark. So he's saying that if it was light outside, there wouldn't necessarily be a need to stall. But if you'd be davening when it's actually night, when it's actually dark, so then we'd go back to this idea of needing to stall. Okay, so now they continue with the Gemara on days and days. So the Gemara starts figuring out these different possibilities of what time it is. So we were at the 2 dots on the top of Beis Beis. Amar Ma'ar Misha Sha'akahonim Nichnas Nechal B'Truma. So from the time the Kohen going to eat the Truma, Reminu, they asked the question, Me'emasai Karnas Shema Ba'arvin. Right, so we have another text which tells us that when do we read Kriya Shema at night? Kisha'ani Nichnas La'achal Pito B'Melach. When the ani goes in to eat his bread with salt. And here, this is apparently earlier, and as Rashi says, she'ein lo ner lahadlik b'sudaso. So he doesn't have a candle, so he goes in a little bit earlier. Ad shah she'omei, that's what it sounds like at least, ad shah she'omei lipatim mitoch sudaso, until the time that he gets up to leave from his suda. So says the Gemara Sefer Vada Pligamas Nisan. So this closing time, the time that he gets up, that clearly is at odds with our Mishnah. That clearly is not what we are ruling. But Reisha, what about the first part? The part when he goes in. And that being the starting time. So Milema Pligamas Nisan. Should we say that also argues on our Mishnah? Do we assume those are 2 different time slots? So says the Gemara